On the menu today, sir, bone marrow on the half bone, tiny bit of peanut butter, just for extra flavor. And may I mention, this is a top quality antler bone. Great for your teeth. Hold on 1 second. I'm gonna be right back, okay? Whoa, what a good boy! Ah, it's good bowl. There you go. Good job, buddy. Would you like to tell everybody what we're doing today? And what's this over here? What's this? Oh, okay. Did you want to talk about it today? Yeah, I think we could manage that. All right, let's do it. Okay, so in this video, I wanted to talk about sphagnum moss. I thought this would be a good first how-to video since it's like one of my most frequently asked questions on Instagram. So to start, the moss that I buy is just packed like this as a dehydrated brick. And the brand that I'm using right now is Will Grow, which I just pick up from one of my local nurseries. If you're from the Vancouver area in Canada, I just get it from Gardenworks. I'll be showing you how I prepare it, how I use it, how I reuse it to make it last a really long time, and then also how I mix it with different substrates and why I do that. But just keep in mind that everything that I do and everything I talk about in this video is just based on my own research and experience. So yeah, let's get started. I should mention that the bricks usually come a lot drier than this one was. I think there was a hole in the bag. But for a typical brick that is really dry, I would just take a spray bottle to mist the top to settle any dust kick up so that you're not breathing it in. I also try and wear a mask while I'm preparing it. And honestly, I'll wear a mask when I'm preparing any kind of potting substrate, especially perlite, because that's one thing you definitely do not want to be breathing in. The next thing I'm going to do is start pulling out things like this. And you'll notice with most moss brands, you're going to have things like twigs and branches and leaves kind of mixed in with the moss, which is totally normal. It's really typical to find forest floor debris with your moss, and it's not going to damage your plants or anything if you don't sit there and pick it all out. It's honestly just preference. Speaking of preference, I'm often asked if there's a certain brand of moss that I prefer. I like spag moss, which is from New Zealand, solely for the reason that it does not have a lot of things like this in it, and it's really clean and kind of looks like this when you get it. Then you're going to grab some water. It doesn't matter what kind, whatever you want to use. I'm just using tap. And then you also want to grab a bowl or a bucket. And it doesn't matter how much water you're using at this point because you're going to wring it out anyway. You just want to make sure that you're getting the moss completely wet. So now I'm going to just push all of that moss to one side and grab my bowl. And then just grab small handfuls or however much you feel comfortable holding. And you're essentially just going to wring out as much water as you can. This is what your moss should look like. It should be pretty easy to kind of pull apart, and the fibers shouldn't be sticking together. It should just be nice and fluffy like this. So now I'm going to show you how I make my moss mix that's a bit more nutrient rich and just has some extra amendments that you probably already used for your soil. What you're going to need is pre-prepared sphagnum moss, some cocoa husk or mulch, perlite that has been pre-washed, lechuzapan that has also been pre-washed, and just a bit of worm castings. And the brand that I use is Gaia Green Organics. You'll also need some type of fertilizer, and what I'll be using is Marfil. I'm going to first start by mixing my sphagnum moss with cocoa husk, and the husk that I buy has already been pre-treated and pre-washed, so if you're just going to be using mulch, I would probably give it a boil first. Next, you're just going to grab some water and the fertilizer that you're using. If you plan to use Marfil like I am, they recommend 20 portions of water to 1 portion of Marfil, but since I do fertilize with liquid gold leaf, I'm only going to be using about 5 dropperfuls for this container. Then you just saturate your moss using some of that fertilizer water and just get it nice and mixed. Then you're going to do the same thing that we did to prepare the moss earlier and just wring out all of the excess water that is in the moss. At this point, your arms should definitely be on fire and your fingers will feel like they want to fall off, but it's worth it, trust me. So when you're done wringing out all the water, you're just going to grab some perlite that's been pre-washed. And I like to pre-wash my perlite because it gets really dusty, so you just want to get rid of all of that before you're mixing it in with your moss. The next amendment is lechuzapan, and if you don't already have this, please don't buy it just to add it to your moss. It's totally unnecessary. I just have extra and I like to add it for the slow release fertilizer. Then you're just going to add your worm castings to give it a little nutrient boost and get that nice and mixed in as well. So now that I showed you how to make moss, I figure I should show you how I actually pot plants using moss. And today I just have my Scindapsus pictus Silver Hero, I think. And it's got some nice long roots now, so I think that it's ready to be moved. I'm going to first start by adding just a very thin layer of moss down at the bottom, making sure not to pack it too tight, because the tighter you actually pack the moss, the less water it holds, and I will show you an example of that in just a little bit. So what I'm doing is basically just positioning it where I want in the pot, and then going around those roots and lightly packing it in with the moss. Make sure not to press too hard because you want your roots to be able to breathe and move around within the moss, and you don't want it to turn into a solid mass. So the reason that I have these in cups is because I wanted to show you the difference between moss that's packed really tightly like this and moss that is packed nice and airy like this, if it would focus. There we go. So I packed these yesterday and I left them out overnight, so it is a little bit dry on top, but you can see, like, maybe you can't see, but it is still quite moist underneath. Sorry if you don't like the word moist. So I'm just going to show you the watering difference between them, and hopefully I can do this right. All right, so this is the tightly packed moss, and I just have a squeeze bottle here. I'm going to show you how the water falls to the bottom. It looks like it's all getting sort of trapped up top. It is kind of moving slowly down, but not really. And this is about as much water as I usually add on a rewatering. Like, I don't want to have to use a lot of this bottle. So, yeah, you can see where it's darker. Sorry, there's like a glare, but you can see where it's darker and it kind of stops like right here. It's not traveling anymore down the bottom. And then let's compare it to the moss that is packed lightly. And you can see how quickly and easily it flows down to the bottom with just a little bit of water. And that's just about as much water as I want to add. And sometimes I'll just go over the top like this. And that's it. And that's how I re-wet my moss. Moving right along, while I unpot my philodendron subhastatum, I wanted to talk about why I try and stretch my sphagnum moss as far as it can go and how I do that. I feel like at this point, some of you guys are wondering about what I'm doing to ensure that my use of sphagnum moss is sustainable, and truth be told, I don't know a whole lot about that part of the industry, but I have researched a little bit and I'll talk about it towards the end of this video. In the meantime, I'm going to show you how I reuse my moss, and actually I don't find myself needing to buy new moss all that often. I've heard that it degrades, but I personally haven't found it to be really fast at degrading, or I haven't really noticed that it's degraded, and I've used the same sort of batch of moss over a really, really long period. I feel like the tendency is to want to throw it out as soon as it starts looking gross. You can just keep sterilizing it and using it over and over again. And the only time that I would really throw moss out is if maybe I had thrips or something. But other than that, just a quick sterilization will get rid of things like fungus and mold buildup or anything else that you don't want on there. I'm going to show you my sterilization process and how I reuse moss. It's actually really easy. All you need to do is bring a pot of water to a boil and put your used moss in there and just let it boil for like 10 to 15 minutes. The only thing I would say is that if you're sensitive to smell, sort of like I am, you can turn the fan on high because there is sort of a smell that comes out of it once it's boiled, but at this point I'm kind of used to it. And if you're wondering, I do sterilize the moss mix that I add amendments to. I just make sure to turn the fan on because, I don't know, I'm kind of paranoid, boiling perlite, and then just give it a good rinse to get all those worm castings out. So you can see that I just pour the sterilized moss into a strainer, and then you're going to want to use some kind of utensil to kind of move around the moss and push it around because it's going to be way too hot for you to handle even with gloves on. And pushing out the water allows it to cool faster, and you just want to leave it for maybe 15 to 20 minutes to cool completely. And here I am yet again giving myself early onset arthritis, and you just want to wring all of that water out, and at this point I would consider this sterile and clean and ready to be reused. And if you didn't know this about sphagnum moss, you can actually wake it back up by just giving it the right conditions, and this is what it looks like when it's woken up. But I will show you what it looks like once it's been left out overnight, and it looks like this. You can see that the fibers sort of closed back up, and it's not that bright fluffy green color anymore, and it's sort of turning back to brown. So I think it's important to know when your moss has woken up versus when it has algae. Alright, so I asked Instagram to ask me questions about sphagnum moss, and I actually got a ton of questions and I wish I could answer them all, but I had to pick the ones that were most frequently asked and then a few extras that I thought were pretty important. So to answer these few questions simply, you actually can grow plants in spag long term, and I've done it before with mostly anthuriums. I grew my Anthurium roquianum purely in spag for close to a year, I'd say, and it did really well, but moving it to an aroid mix just kind of gives it more nutrients that it needs to grow really robust roots, really big leaves, and I don't have a ton of experience of growing in spag like really long term, but I know that you can keep it in there for a pretty long time and still have a perfectly healthy plant. I wish I had a perfect answer to this question, but I don't think one exists, to be honest. Only because I've had as much success growing in moss as I have in soil, so I don't really have a formula. I just kind of let the plants tell me what they need, just based on like how big the leaves are and like how healthy the leaves are and how quickly the plant is growing or how many leaves it can hold on to at once. And I just let all those factors sort of like guide me into the right substrate for it. And for example, my queen was grown purely in sphagnum moss. It never saw a day in soil from the time I had it until the day it gave me like the two most beautiful leaves that I could have never even imagined it would give me. And then not long after that second leaf fully hardened off and unfurled, the first one was super quick to go, and just based on all of these things, I felt like it should have been able to hold on to that first leaf a lot longer. So that's when I made the decision to move it to soil. If you follow me on Instagram, you probably know of my obsession with growing aroids without drainage holes. And even though that's my preference, I would never advise against growing with drainage holes because I think they're great. And I would say maybe 40% of my collection is being grown with drainage holes. In my experience, the spag dries out much faster in pots with drainage. Especially if you're using those clear orchid pots. I think one thing I do usually follow though, and I do this pretty consistently, is if I'm growing a plant in spag, if it's under a 6-inch pot, I like to not have drainage holes, and then anything above a 6-inch pot, I do like to use drainage. I may just be immune to it by now, but I haven't really noticed that my moss is super smelly. I think one thing that I could maybe contribute is airflow. Airflow is super important. If you leave anything in stagnant, hot, humid air without like fresh airflow, you're kind of bound to get sort of like nasty things that grow. So if you're using moss like in an Exoterra, a Millsbo cabinet, whatever it is, make sure that you're giving that container or even a prop box. Give it some fresh air. Don't let it be really stagnant and stale and like hot and humid for too long, or else things can go pretty bad. The answer to this one is definitely. Always reuse it if you can. You can use it for moss poles, you can use it for moss walls, you can use it as bedding in one of your greenhouses. You can use it for propagations. I showed you earlier how to sterilize it. So honestly, like if the moss is good, if it hasn't been like infested with thrips or overtaken by some gross mold that won't go away, don't throw it away. So I've had 100% success rate rooting alocasia bulbs in moss. I've tried soil propagation, perlite propagation, leca propagation, and I've lost some and have also had success with some, but moss is still like my go-to method. You basically just want to stick it in a takeout container, just bury the bulb a little bit, you can even have the tip sticking out, and give it some warmth, give it some light, some humidity, and let it do its thing. I actually only chop moss if I'm planning to add it to an aroid soil mix. And the reason that I do that is because I find that moving a plant from moss into soil has better success rate when there's chopped up moss in it. And the reason that I don't like to put it in as a long fiber is because Moss holds on to a lot of water, like I showed you earlier, and I don't really want a lot of that excess water being held in my soil. Aeroid soil should be very aerated, well draining, and if you've got like these chunks of long fibered moss in it, you have a chance of water just kind of being pocketed in there, and I try to avoid that by having them really shredded and cut up, and you still get a lot of the benefits that moss has with robust root growth and not really having to worry about things like root rot. Okay, so this is a really important one. I'm gonna try and answer it without rambling too much because I feel like this could be its own video, but again, keep in mind, all I know is what's available to me online, what I've read in forums, and all of the research that I've done on my own. First off, I think it's important to know the difference between sphagnum moss and peat moss. Essentially, they are the same plant, but in different forms, but they are not the same thing. It's kind of confusing, but if you didn't know, sphagnum moss and peat moss are grown in swamps and bogs. I think that they're native mostly to New Zealand and I believe Canada, but sphagnum moss is the plant that floats above the surface of the water, and sphagnum peat moss is sphagnum moss that has sunk down to the bottom of the swamp and has basically decomposed over years and years, and that creates sort of the foundation of the ecosystem of this swamp. So the issue surrounding harvesting peat moss is that you basically can only get it if you disturb the entire swamp. Like you're literally taking the floor of this swamp and just like bringing it all back up, you know? But sphagnum moss, it can be harvested because it's above the water. And I think a lot of people will say, oh, it's sustainable because you're not needing to dig it up. But it really depends on how it's being harvested, I feel, because you can still, whether you're using machines or it's being hand-picked, you can still be disturbing these swamps by, you know, machines that are going in it or people that are walking around in it. So I do think that it's just kind of a matter of doing your research on these companies and making sure that they're following any guidelines and laws regarding harvesting their products sustainably and making sure they're not breaking any laws. So my advice would be to go with the big brands because I feel like those are the ones that are being scrutinized the most. And I'm not sure if you guys have seen it, but you can get pretty cheap sphagnum moss online. I'm not going to mention which sites or which country it comes from, but I'm talking like $2.99 for like a brick of it. And while that's tempting, I don't necessarily feel confident that that moss was harvested sustainably. So again, I only know what companies are advertising, and companies like ProMix say that they harvest their peat moss sustainably. Do I know that for sure? I have no clue. So my only advice is go with the bigger brands. Maybe that's awful advice, but that's what I do, and make it last a really long time. Honestly, unless you're like growing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plants in moss, you really don't need to be buying it all that often. Stretch it out, mix it with different amendments so that you can make more with using less moss, sterilize it, take care of it, and just don't be wasteful. And to end this topic, I wanted to circle back to one of the questions, and it was sphagnum versus peat moss. I know that like a lot of people like to grow in peat moss, and a lot of nurseries will use like purely peat moss to grow their plants in, but I don't find like any real benefit that I've documented that has proven that like my soil needs more peat moss. If you didn't know, soil is already made with like a good amount of peat moss, and so I just don't see the point in needing to add more. So if I had to choose, I'm gonna say sphagnum moss all the way, just because apparently it's more sustainable and you can make it last longer and you can reuse it, rather than something like peat moss. Like once you use it, it's done after that. Honestly, I don't think that there's any substrate out there that fungus gnats love more than soil. Wet soil especially. Fungus gnats love wet substrates, so I would say that they're definitely less attracted to moss than soil. And I'm not going to say this is 100% effective, but it's been very effective for me, and I've been topping all of my soil plants with just a really thin layer of moss, just enough that it just kind of dries out and creates like a barrier between the moss and the air. And I just find that fungus gnats are less attracted to it than it would be if there was no moss. Okay, this is the last question I'm going to answer, and I'm going to try and make it fast. I do like both methods. I like water propagating if I know I'm moving the plant to passive hydro, and I like moss propagating if I know I'm going to move it to soil. But just note that water roots and soil/moss roots are different, and I think I'm going to talk about that in another video. And if you made it this far, I was not going to make you sit through almost half an hour of my awkward voiceovers without your Pudge content. So here is his 4th birthday. Oh, thank you. You have something on your lip. Is there a ghost? Crap. Okay, I have something to tell you. Did you know that today is your birthday? What do you want to do today? Do you want to eat a cake? Do you want to go for a walk? Do you want to go to PetSmart and buy a new toy? Okay, let's go. Let's go.
Oh my gosh, is that your toy?
Do you want to show him what toy you picked?